The history of emotional intelligence started with a politician, an affair, and a boat, and two researcher friends who were talking about how could this smart guy be so stupid. Back in the 1980s, there was an American politician named Gary Hart. And I don't know if you remember the story, but during his campaign, some reporters said, "Mr. Hart, are you having an affair?" And lo and behold, a few days later, there was a picture of him and his mistress in his boat. Two researchers, Peter Salovey and John Mayer, John goes by Jack, were talking about this. How can a guy who's that smart be so stupid? Most of us would kind of end the conversation there, but Peter and Jack are emotions and cognition researchers. And so they got curious. Well, maybe our definition of smart is missing some important ingredient. They doodled out this idea of how emotions and thinking could work together. And Harvard Business Review calls emotional intelligence a paradigm-shattering idea. And this is the paradigm that's being shattered. Leave emotions out of it to make a good decision. That's what everybody says. Peter and Jack were wondering, what happens if instead we look at how emotions could help us think? One of the interesting areas of research by Antonio Damasio, who is part of the origin story of emotional intelligence. He talked about Phineas Gage, this guy who had a pipe in his head and damaged certain parts of his brain, and yet other parts were still working. Antonio Damasio has studied emotions and how they work in our brain and how we think and how we become conscious of ourselves and the world around us. Damasio says emotions are embodied. And he also says emotions are entwined in the neural networks of reason. And this is what we're learning, is understanding how emotions and cognition work together. They're not really two separate things. Emotion and cognition are actually both part of intelligence, and they use the same neurological circuitry. So in 1990, Peter and Jack, they published a paper in an obscure academic journal. Hardly anybody read it. There was a science writer for the New York Times named Dan Goleman, and his job was to read obscure academic journals and find interesting things. And he saw this article and he said, wow, I want to learn more about this. So he started talking to different people who were working in this space of emotion and cognition. He ended up coming to a school where I happened to be a new teacher. Then this is in 1992, and he came and he looked at what we were doing there and he said, "You're teaching emotional intelligence." And we said, "It's amazing. Tell us about this term." And he shared with us Peter and Jack's work and Reuven Bar-On's work and Candace Pert's work and other things that were happening in this just beginning of this explosion of neuroscience in learning about how emotions and the brain actually work together. Dan's book came out and it became an international bestseller. And he'd written about our process as one of the models of how you actually develop and use emotional intelligence. And when the book became an international bestseller, people started calling us from all over the world. And that led us to start 6 Seconds to answer that question. And Dan's book comes out and offers this vision to say, well, emotional intelligence is something learnable, and it actually matters more than cognitive intelligence. Now, there's some wild claims in the book that didn't bear the test of time, but the basic premise has. And this notion that there are these learnable, measurable, scientifically grounded skills for being smarter with feelings, for accurately acquiring emotional data and using it. And Peter and Jack went on and tested this a great deal. Many other researchers have tested different ways that emotions and cognition work together. And then the invention of the functional magnetic resonance imager. And all of a sudden we were able to start seeing inside people's brains, almost in real time. And then all kinds of interesting new technologies in neuroscience in just the last few years, where you can look in a very precise way at how different parts of the brain are connected, and the discovery of mirror neurons, and all of this growing understanding that emotions are part of how our brain actually works. Now it's your turn. What's next for the future of emotional intelligence?